There seems to be a misunderstanding of subjective value when it comes to our modern political discourse. And we've heard politicians such as Bernie Sanders imply that it's unjust to see a society where baseball players, or basketball players for that matter, make $200 or $300 million contracts, while we see teachers or doctors make a fraction of that. And this argument has been replayed for decades. I've been hearing it since I was a little child. I've been hearing the same arguments made against the idea that someone such as Justin Timberlake or Justin Bieber can make millions or tens of millions of dollars per year, whereas people who are surgeons or people who are teachers or people who perform essential tasks don't make quite as much. But this is a faulty comparison. It makes someone look as if they don't understand economics and just the nature of subjective value. Because if you understood what subjective value is, you'd understand why we see disparities in incomes between athletes and teachers. Because if we just look at it objectively, the subjective value provided by one athlete, such as Derek Jeter, obviously exceeds the value provided by any single teacher in the United States. So if you were to compare Derek Jeter with a Brooklyn public school teacher, yes, the public school teacher in Brooklyn is performing an essential duty, but at the same time, how many students is he really servicing? Maybe 25 or 30 students at a time. It's a very personal job. You have to know the students by name. You'd have to mentor them and spend time with them for a whole year before you get a next batch of 30 students. Whereas someone such as Derek Jeter or Michael Jordan, they can entertain millions upon millions of customers without ever having to meet them, without having to know them. And some of these customers could be living across the world paying for their items or paying for their entertainment through a television screen. So it is a faulty comparison. It makes people seem to understand as if that someone's need or someone's value upon the society must be reflective on their wage. But that's not how society works, because you're not going to compare a single teacher with a single athlete. Now, if you were to compare all the teachers with all the athletes, now that's a more appropriate comparison. But if you're going to compare, hypothetically, 400 players in the NBA, maybe 1,600 players who play in the NFL, maybe 1,000 or so players who play in the Major League Baseball, if you compare them to the millions upon millions of teachers who live and work in the United States and Canada, obviously the teachers dwarf them in size and numbers, and of course, more resources are going towards expenses such as healthcare and education compared to entertainment, such as Major League Baseball or the NBA or Taylor Swift concert tickets and so on and so on. So it's a faulty comparison, because you have to understand is that there is only one Taylor Swift, there's only one Michael Jordan, there's only one Derek Jeter. But when it comes to teachers, we have millions of teachers in every state, in every country, and they all service maybe a few dozen students at a time. So of course there's going to be a difference when it comes to value produced, but most people understand this. Intuitively, if you were to explain to somebody at the age of 12, they'd understand why someone who's a famous singer or a famous athlete or a movie producer or even a successful CEO is going to get more compensation, is going to make more income than someone who's a doctor or someone who's a lawyer or someone who is a teacher. Intuitively, most people seem to understand this, but we seem to notice that there are some voices in America and Canada today who don't understand this. And we've seen it from Bernie Sanders himself, a presidential candidate in the US, who made this same argument. Now, these are juvenile arguments that don't pass the smell test. Yet for some reason, we are seeing a return to this sort of politics, this sort of populist politics, where you have people who, let's say they want to envy the rich, or they seem to want to equalize the wealth, and this is the motivation of why they're making this sort of approach. Now, in the past, about 8 years ago, 10 years ago, we noticed the Occupy Wall Street movement, and they were protesting against the corruption on Wall Street with the Washington and the government. So they were protesting specifically a certain number of billionaires and millionaires who they felt were gaming the system, whether they be hedge fund traders or Wall Street executives or CEOs. They were focusing on the corrupt billionaires, the corrupt millionaires, the people who they felt were responsible for crashing the global economy in 2008. That was the argument. But now 10 years later, we're starting to see arguments coming from presidential candidates, no less, decry the very notion of someone making tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars for playing a sport. Now, if you're an athlete or you're a singer, you're not on Wall Street, you're an entertainer. You're not crashing the global economy. You are not underpaying your workers. You're not doing any of that. You're just completely focused on your craft. You're focused on entertaining millions of customers, whether you sing or whether you dance or whether you play ball or whatever it is that you do. And now we've noticed a shift in this rhetoric. This is not the same rhetoric we noticed 10 years ago, which a lot of that rhetoric was understandable to an extent, especially when you consider in 2010 and 2011 during the Occupy Wall Street movement, there were a lot of people who were shafted as a result of the '08 crash. A lot of people, they lost their businesses, they lost their livelihoods, they were working paycheck to paycheck, they couldn't find a job in many cases. And of course, this frustration led to the Occupy Wall Street movement. But today we've noticed a little bit of a shift in that rhetoric. We've noticed it isn't so much that they're upset at the rich people who are crashing the global economy or polluting the waterways or getting bailouts from the government. They're focused on targeting people who otherwise shouldn't have been targeted. I mean, who in their right mind in the political sphere wastes 5 minutes of their time critiquing the salary of a Major League Baseball player? Only someone who seems to believe in very different things than most people here in North America believe. And we need to understand that there's a nuance and that there's a difference. When you go to the regular person on the street and you ask them their concerns, they'll explain to you they're mostly against what they'd consider the corrupt billionaires or the corrupt executives. Those are the people who should be criticized. But for some reason, we've noticed a shift away from that. And now we're noticing these types of conversations being brought up by folks like Bernie Sanders, who's not a fringe person anymore. He might have been considered fringe 10 years ago, but he did finish second to Joe Biden in the presidential race. He is one of the most popular senators in the United States. He does have a lot of Congress people who do think like him, and a lot of millennials also do think like him. And as a result, we're forced to deal with these ideas, and we're forced to deal with these cancerous, and it really is cancerous, these cancerous conclusions. Because Bernie Sanders, what he seems to be arguing and what he seems to believe is that the wealth pie is fixed. So if someone like Michael Jordan or someone like Derek Jeter makes $100 million, then that means there's less money for everybody else. But that is absolutely not true. The subjective value provided by Derek Jeter when you are sitting and watching a baseball game obviously exceeds whatever money you gave up to experience that. So if Derek Jeter was to make 25 cents for every television viewer or 50 cents per television viewer, that person sitting on his couch, he's sitting there for 2 hours. He's got himself an entertainment experience. Maybe he had a long day at work. And maybe after a long day at work, he comes home, sits on his couch, grabs a beer, and watches a baseball game. And he values that experience enough to sit there and actually watch the game. And it might be 25 or 50 cents per viewer, but if your neighbor is watching Derek Jeter and his neighbor is watching it, before you know it, it does add up to tens of millions of dollars. Believe it or not. Believe it or not, that's exactly how it works. It's the same thing when it comes to buying Taylor Swift albums. You might have bought 1 or 2 Taylor Swift albums and you might have given her $5 or $10 per album you purchased, but if you multiply that over millions and millions of customers across the world, it's going to add up to quite a lot of money. That's a difference, and that's what they don't seem to understand. And what you're doing about all of this, I don't watch baseball, but who am I to supersede my judgments on how much a baseball player is worth compared to the people who actually watch the sport, the people who actually buy tickets to watch the games at the stadium, or the people who watch it from their couch. At the end of the day, there is subjective value there. Same thing when it comes to musicians who I don't listen to. They justifiably make millions of dollars because there's a market for it. And that is the reason why they make what they do. I cannot supersede my judgments and tell a young 21-year-old woman not to buy Taylor Swift concert seats. I personally wouldn't buy those seats. I personally wouldn't go to a concert, but there are some people who do. And as a result, if there are enough of them who do, of course there's going to be someone like Taylor Swift who makes a lot of money. Who are we to say that someone who writes fantasy novels like J.K. Rowling, why does she have to earn millions and hundreds of millions of dollars writing a book about fantasy? Why there are other authors who write about history, they might write about social issues, and their books don't sell nearly as many copies as J.K. Rowling's fantasy novel. Why? Because subjective value in the eyes of millions of customers, they said to themselves, this Harry Potter fantasy novel is more entertaining to me and worth my time for me to purchase a $20 book. Stand in line, go to the bookstore, buy the book, and actually read the book. And there are more of them than there are those who are spending their money on more important tasks or more important subjects. And that's just the nature of consumer sentiment. People want what they want. Who am I to tell someone who's buying a Gucci sweater for $1,000 that they're wrong for what they bought? I mean, at the end of the day, they could have purchased a sweater for $50. They could have purchased a sweater for $100. But there are some people who convince themselves in their mind that it's worth it to purchase a $1,000 sweater, and that's what they did. And I may disagree with it. I may think it's a waste of money, but this is what the consumer wanted. And who am I to tell someone what to do with their own money?